All right, guys, we're going to finish up our lectures on the Progressive Era by examining the two biggest events in foreign policy during the time. The Spanish-American War really goes back to the Cuban Rebellion, as Spain had been really punishing Cuba quite a bit. They had put 300,000 Cubans into concentration camps, and they were really trying to emphasize a very dictatorial government. And American businessmen were worried about the loss of trade with Cuba, and people were pushing that William McKinley should go to war. Uh, and McKinley had been in the Civil War, and he really didn't want to do this. But guys like Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst had used their positions as newspapermen to influence public opinion and push for war. And so you really have a dynamic that's emerged between politics and the media. So in 1898, McKinley has sent the battleship USS Maine to protect American citizens in Cuba, just trying to be a show of force. But in February, the ship explodes, killing 260 men, and immediately guys like Hearst and Pulitzer blame the Spanish for it. And the U.S. is pushed into the position of having to recognize Cuban independence and declare war on Spain.
William McKinley was the last of the presidents who had served during the Civil War. And he said, "I have seen the bodies piled like cordwood." And he wasn't about to launch on a war unless it was absolutely necessary.
But McKinley eventually bowed to unyielding pressure from hawks in Congress and warmongering media mogul William Hearst, and sent a battleship to Havana Harbor, the USS Maine.
And certainly sending a battleship into someone else's harbor at a time when there's an incipient Cuban revolution going on, and had been for quite some time, is a provocative move. McKinley had rather ambitious war plans ready to go.
160 active U.S. naval ships were on alert all over the globe, in the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and in the Philippines, when the USS Maine exploded under mysterious circumstances, killing 250 Americans.
It was attributed to Spanish perfidy. And the advocates of war said, we must avenge the deaths of American sailors aboard the Maine.
The media turned into a double-edged sword for McKinley, pushing public opinion towards war.
Journalism was a different beast back then. The journalists of that era were aggressive.
The press that more and more thinks it has a role to play in politics and investigative reporting is really taking off.
The headlines, "Remember the Maine and to hell with Spain," blared from Hearst-owned newspapers across the country. McKinley, still haunted by his memories of the Civil War, hesitated to make the final declaration.
He largely left the decision in the hands of Congress when it was clear that they would go to war no matter what he wanted.
On April 25, 1898, Congress declared war on Spain, and McKinley signed it.
In the Pacific, Admiral George Dewey, who had been notified that this might happen a little bit earlier, sinks the entire Spanish fleet at the Battle of Manila, and the landing forces in the Philippines are helped out by Emilio Aguinaldo and the other Philippine rebels, and they end up capturing the Philippines very, very quickly. It's the fighting in Cuba where things get a little bit dicey.
As one particular colonel, Theodore Roosevelt, led his squad of Rough Riders into battle on Cuba's San Juan Hill, McKinley brought the White House into the 20th century.
McKinley creates the Situation Room. And the Situation Room is important because it has this new instrument, the telegraph, which allows him to get real-time updates what's taking place in the battlefield.
The Spanish-American War lasted 10 weeks, with fighting taking place in the Caribbean and the Pacific. The U.S. would emerge victorious and take on a new role: colonial power.
The United States did, at the end of the war, annex the Philippines and Puerto Rico. And McKinley was criticized by those people who contended that the United States should not become an empire. But the Philippines, he said, cannot govern themselves. And if the United States had not stayed, the Germans might have taken the Philippines. The Japanese might have taken the Philippines.
The Spanish-American War is important because America emerges from the war as a global power. And in doing so, it enhances the power of the president as commander-in-chief.
McKinley added to America's global expansion with the annexation of Hawaii in 1898.
17,000 troops landed in Cuba to help the Cuban fighters, and a quarter of them were African-American. In fact, even Teddy Roosevelt had formed this volunteer unit called the Rough Riders. They have a huge victory at San Juan Hill, the most important victory of the war. And in August of 1898, the Spanish were defeated. It was often referred to as a splendid little war because of how quickly the United States won. The United States gets to be a protectorate of Cuba. The U.S. gets control of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. We pay $20 million to Spain for the Philippines. In 1901, we get Cuba its independence, but we get to keep the naval base at Guantanamo Bay. We still have to this day. In Panama, things are a little bit different. In 1901, the United States bought a lease from France for $40 million to build a canal across Panama. We offered a 99-year lease on the land to build the canal for $10 million and $250,000 a year in rent to Colombia, who controlled Panama. They reject the deal. So we support a revolution in Panama, recognizing Panamanian independence, and the very first thing they do is allow us to build the canal.
The canal would enable the United States to project its naval power. Roosevelt took that idea and did something about it.
There was one obstacle to building the 102-mile-long canal: the country that owned the property, Colombia. The Senate ratified a treaty to lease the land, but Colombia refused to sign. Congress had tried things their way, and now Roosevelt would try his.
Roosevelt quietly helped foment a revolution in Panama, which establishes itself as an independent country. And to help foster that revolution, Roosevelt stationed ships close by so that Colombia really couldn't get their troops to Panama to put down that revolution. Panama declares independence. Like a few minutes after that, maybe an hour, America recognizes Panama as a country.
TR was very shrewd to create this new country that would then cede to the U.S. the rights to build a canal through their property.
It would take 12 years for the Panama Canal to be completed, but Roosevelt couldn't wait that long to see what he believed would be his great legacy.
Roosevelt is the first president to go abroad. He visited Panama as the Panama Canal was being built.
How are we going to address the growing political power and military power of the U.S. in a world where from Japan to Germany, there are tensions are brewing?
Roosevelt believed that the key to preserving America's interest and also expanding America's economic influence was to have a two-ocean navy. And the key to that was to build a canal that would allow American ships to move quickly from the Atlantic to the Pacific.
As the canal was being carved out of the mud, Roosevelt convinced Congress to build a strong navy to use it. He more than doubled the number of personnel from 10,000 to nearly 25,000 and increased its battleships from 10 to 25, making it second in the world only to Britain.
After the canal was built, as the canal was being built, the biggest problems were yellow fever and malaria. Men were dying just from disease all the time. But eventually, by 1914, after 40,000 men that worked on the canal, it has opened and cut 7,000 miles off the trip from New York to San Francisco. Thanks, guys, for paying attention. Hopefully we took good notes.